Hey guys, this is Rurouni K95 here, and once again, it's time for a new video that I haven't thought of doing one like this particularly. We're going to be talking about the debating on here, especially for today. I'm going to be discussing about the debate of how the difference between reading manga and reading comics, as how this goes particularly as well. Although I have been reading 3,132 manga books in the past, particularly because I have been reading so much manga books in the past. Although I have read some graphic novels, especially like comics as well. Especially like I read like particularly 43 comics. I think I used to read those as well. Come to think of it as well. It's not like I'm saying is this better than comics? No, it's not that I'm talking about. It's not what I meant. No, it's basically more different, I suppose, in a little more perspective kind of thing as well. Well, I think how you want to expect to how I'm learning the fact is that how I'm wanted to know particularly of how what's difference of how you're reading manga and let's say for example there's 1,000 titles of manga, like for example there's Blade of the Immortal, Berserk, Vinland Saga. There's a lot of manga titles out here as from the points of how you expect as well, particularly as well because even though manga is starting to becoming how every comic fan haven't read a manga before, there's a lot out there as well. Especially because I'm doing it in a little more conservative feel of how the difference of how I have particularly. Although I think I read some comics in the as how you expect of how this is going to the point of views as how considered how comic fans were never a fan of mangas in general. Like, say, for example, they want to read One Piece, right? Well, if they don't like the manga, they can just drop it, or they can give it to a person who loves collecting manga as a gift. That's just easy. In a little more thing which is called respect as well. From how I'm wondering the fact. Although, I may read both manga as well as comics as well. Well, comics in there, because there's some indie stuff like IDW Studios, as well as Dark Horse Comics, as there's a lot of them out there, especially the indie stuff, though, as well. Well, the only thing that how it got me more perspective of how this got me introduced to, like, reading the comics, basically, especially some stuff that is a take on samurai, such as Stan Sakai's comic, Usagi Yojimbo, which in my opinion, basically, because Usagi Yojimbo is basically my favorite Stan Sakai comic, because I thought is basically, when I first read the Usagi Yojimbo comic, when I was at a library, I really enjoyed it, basically, which I think this is a lot more different of how it's supposed to reading mangas, and it's how it's different from before, particularly. Well, technically, this is not exactly a debate. No, I'm calling this as a perspective reading differences as well. Let's just call it a reading the differences as well. Not exactly a debate. No. It's just that how I'm explaining about how there's differences of how you're reading manga as well, or reading comic books as well, to learn how you expect of how this, well, say for example, comic books, they're like in full color, as how it's different particularly, some on here, like say there's some horror comics, like say, for example, The Walking Dead, there is those hardcover ones as well, because I never knew that this is how you want to expect of how I have my different reading perspective of how I'm giving in the facts of how this is more different as well, because I'm starting to be a little more conservative way as well. Some have the credibilities of how what comic artists have been doing, the styles and the substance of how they do it as well, particularly creative works on how every stand. Say, for example, there's some, like, for the superhero comics, for example, you have Marvel, DC, and you have Marvel as well. Particularly of how to learn the fact of how this has gotten to the testimony of how it's a lot more different, I suppose, as well. Because, well, there's some, well, most of the things, that's how most comics, have been adapted, have been collected as graphic novels. Like, say, for example, like the Hulk, the Incredible Hulk, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the X-Men, as well as every other superhero comics out there, of how they have been collected as a graphic novel. Consider the fact of how this is basically true as how this goes, particularly in its own certain way of how in the Western comics as well, from to the points of how it's different, not just manga in general, although I love manga, but I can read both in general, in my own little perspective feel. Don't hate me for this, but this is my own little perspective, because I have to do, the only reason why I have read both manga as well as comics in a little variety sort of feel of how it's more different as well. A little more variety feeling, right? Because I think I have read some comics, particularly, especially that I borrowed from libraries. I think I borrowed a lot of them as well. Particularly something of what are my favorites, of what I like. There's some of them out there that some may like, some don't like it, some hate it, some can like it as a guilty pleasure favorite. It depends on what of the comics are, particularly as to expect of how it feels, basically. Because how same goes with manga. Some may like a manga, some consider it the favorite manga, some hate the manga, some don't like it, some think it's okay, some think it's a decent manga, or some can say like the manga's a guilty pleasure favorite of how they love, despite how some hate it as well. As how you would expect how this basically has the different things as how two or less of how the satisfactory results between manga as well as and American comics out there. Well, to the thing though, the manga business has been outselling like American comics basically, of how they do the outstanding of how they always wanted to do the sales depending on what they always do as well, wasn't it? Speaking of which, well, I may read both in my opinion, because I had to do it again. I had to read it for like a little variety sort of thing as well, because I may be a little concerned as how I come by on how I'm learning the difference, particularly. Sorry about my neck as well. Anyway, so the thing about how the difference between reading manga or comics in there, because there's a lot of numbers of how they prove of how the reason why how manga has been outselling comics, because manga has been having a lot of sales of how they do this. Well, in tips or favorite, I'm not going to say prefers, overs, or ifs. I'm going to say as particularly how I read both in a variety sort of thing as well. I mean, I do mind comics. I mean, there's some I like as well. Well, there's some, like, autobiographic comics as well. Like, say, for example, Marjane Satrapi did her graphic novel biographic in a own little comic feel which is called Persepolis, as how they basically how this is more different as opposed to than any other ones out there in general. Furthermore, basically of how in a more alternative variety sort of ways of how, especially if you ever read than any other comics. Furthermore, if there's any more questionable things of how you're reading some superhero comics, if you ever read anything from Marvel, or if you read anything from DC, or any of the comic companies as well as these indie comics from those indie comics as well, particularly of how, despite though that manga has been outselling all of the entire U.S. comic industry, though, I have read both for the variety of sort of thing as well, particularly how, especially of how I'm doing a little more conservative thing as well. Because, say, comic fans hasn't read a manga, there's a lot out there, again, accordingly, as how you would expect of how there as well. Well, I may read both manga and comics in general, particularly as well, because I have to read it for a variety of things as well, just for the values of how, despite how there are some differences of how. I mean, the manga uses like those manga paddles as well, from how you would expect, particularly as well. So this basically how, from the point of views as well, because I have read some comics in general, particularly, I have been read one, despite I haven't read one since the 43rd one, which was Immortal Hulk comic as well, because despite though the how you would expect of how you would learn as well, because I know their manga success of how the delusions on the Western comic books, well, technically manga had to overtake comic books in the U.S. sales as well, considered how the fact of how most manga readers prefer manga over comics in a little more biased sort of way, just in the same things how manga was outselling comics as well. Well, in my opinion, there are some good comics out there. There are some terrible comics out there. Some want to know the things as well. Well, because it's basically despite I haven't been reading any of them in a while. Well, I think I mind them as well, particularly of how the differences of how, the question is of how the differences of the art style, like the comic art style, the eyes in the American comics are like smaller eyes, well, which is basically considered like Western comics, particularly by many comic fans would know. Same goes with manga, the art style. The art style of the manga is very distinctive of how they do this for, like, particularly how Japanese mangas are, how they made. Because the eyes on the manga, they're basically large, and that's how you basically call it as, depending on whether it's male or female, and the eyes in what you see in the manga, which is more different than comics, basically, particularly how, considering the fact of how this has got to the point of view of how it's going into an honest perspective way on that, well, as how you expect as well, from the points of how this basically how it's gotten to the ways of how manga is reading manga is more different than comics, basically, in general. Well, I don't mind comics as well. I have nothing against, but because I bet you manga has been outselling particularly comics in the U.S. market, particularly from point starters as well. Well, you get the point though as well. Well, I think I read both, in my opinion, in a little perspective, variety sort of value of how I make it clear, basically. Despite how it doesn't mean I'm not toxic. No, it's just I'm more concerned and a little more conservative of how it's more different as a historian, basically. Like say for example, like I'm basically the master of having a lot of history of how I've been reading manga and some comics, basically, of how to expect of how to expect to the points as how you would know how it's more different than any other been done before, as how they would expect to how, considering the fact how manga has outselling American comics, as how the sales particularly, well, that's different from any other, well, because I had to say it as ins or ors. I'm not going to put in there, because I think prefer, like, I read both in general, particularly, as how, it's just my opinion, basically, how it's more different, because I think it's part of my reading perspective as well, from the looks, as how you expect, how I understand how true this goes as well. Well, there's some Japanese monster in like comics graphic novel ones. There's the Godzilla ones. I think I've read the Godzilla ones as well, because I thought it was basically pretty cool as well, for the own little reading perspective value as well, despite how to expect of how you like to read it in general, particularly as how I want to know about this that I haven't thought of until now, which it definitely is basically the icing on the cake as well. I mean, there's a group, so many cooks, too many writers, too many artists, particularly, whether it's either a indifference between either if it's for Japanese manga artists, which is more different as opposed to American and comic artists particularly. But that's basically how it's different from the points as how I want to expect as well. Yeah, maybe of how, because I wanted to do like a little more difference in reading perspective as well, of how I understand basically how to the thing as well. It depends on whether it's how the story's about, especially whether it's a comic or a Japanese manga in general, particularly accordingly. One of the things of how it's levels on a spectrum of how your reading perspective, either a Japanese manga or American comic, particularly. This has gone to the point, though, as how I understand basically as well. Because I understand why. Because I have been reasonable. That I have been experiencing that I haven't thought of like that until now. As how, one thing about how it's reading manga is more different from reading comic books, though, particularly. Because I'm doing this as a little reviewing purposes, basically, as a little conservative way as well, particularly because there's basically how it's more different from any others than done before as well. From the points as how it's the head starters as well. Because that's true basically how considering the fact of how manga has been outselling US comics, considered how it messed with Marvel or DC in its own certain way of how to learn to the fact of how this basically how it's basically how manga's still going, particularly. This has to admit to the fact of how this basically goes in its own certain way as well. Well, that's true thing basically of how because I'm doing this for the own little reading perspective way of how it feels, of how it goes particularly well. Yeah, that's more how you would have done before basically as well. How you would have done before, of the sheer feeling of how the difference between reading manga or comic books in general, basically. From how you would have learned to know of how doing a little more considerative feel as well, from what I understand basically well. From the things as how manga is basically outselling comic books basically because of the sales as well, because I think they're outselling it basically from the looks as well, just so how I can understand the reason why. 'Cause I'm not putting in like the verses, or I'm just putting in the difference of how it's different from the other particularly in general, because it's just my opinion basically, from the ways of how you want to expect of how some, if you want to read comics basically, you find in graphic novel ones, you find those at like probably you find those at libraries as well particularly, which I understand why of how it's more different particularly as well. Now, well, I like manga, but I was more in a little reading perspective feeling. I mind graphic novel comics, also in a little more perspective feeling of how for the reading perspective ways as well, considering the fact of how they wanted to do this as on its own little certain matter as well, from what I understand basically why some type of things of how some comics have been considered for graphic novels as well, besides those old issue comics, whether it's either from Marvel or DC as well in general, particularly as well. From what I understand, the thing as well, which you get the point picture as well, from what I understand basically why as well. So that's going to be it for my video for today, you guys. Thank you for watching, but before we go, here's what I'm going to say for this one. Because I wanted to do a little more reading perspective differences of how it's a lot more different from the others in general, particularly. Because I wanted to do it in a little more respective variety sort of discussion I wanted to do for this video, basically. Because I wanted to do this new discussion video about especially the differences between reading manga or reading US comic books as well, as how to learn to the point of views as well, from how it's, because I decided to have it in both difference as well, from what I understand basically of how they're, so that's the thing as well. Because because I wanted to do a video like this, that I haven't done one before until now, because I wanted to do it as a little discussion type of video as well. Subscribe for content, my anime pilot link in the description down below. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below on this video if you like as well. Be sure to smack the notifications bell button. Be sure to get notified also for the latest update. Hit the subscribe button if you want to check. If you're feel free to join my channel as well. Smack the like button if you enjoy this video as well. If you want to check out my anime planet, the link will be in the description down below as well, because I wanted to do this discussion video particularly as well, because I wanted to do this video in a little more conservative way and keep it otaku for the manga as well. If for comic fans out there, I'm doing this for the little respective feel, because I read both in general in a little variety sort of reason as well, which I understand why, because I read both in a little respective kind of feel as well. This is RuRoniK95 saying thank you for watching my video, and I'm glad you liked it. I hope you enjoy it. Hope to see you soon for the next video. Hope you have a great day. This is RuRoniK95 signing off, and thank you for watching my video, and I will see you soon for more videos.